Ian Curtis was one of the most unique artists you could find in the post-punk scene in the late 70s and 80s. His deep, deadpan vocals, his seizure-like dance, and his interesting background story is both fascinating and nerve-wracking at the same time, especially if you look at the hardships he had to go through emotionally and physically. Despite of suffering from epilepsy and a crumbling relationship, he was able to leave us with some amazing music that has left a mark on rock music as we know it. Let's take a closer look. Ian Kevin Curtis was best known as the vocalist and songwriter for the English post-punk rock band Joy Division. They released their debut album Unknown Pleasures in 1979 and their follow-up album Closer in 1980. Ian Kevin Curtis grew up in a working-class household in Macclesfield, Cheshire. He was very interested in reading from an early age, and he soon developed an interest for literature, philosophy, and particularly the poetry of Tom Gunn. And on several occasions he received awards from his school for his talents in writing. But Ian wasn't always just the good and intelligent kid his parents wanted him to be. While in his mid-teens, he would perform social service by visiting the elderly as a part of a school program. He and his friends would on several occasions steal prescription drugs and later take them as a part of a group. One time when they were taking drugs, Ian consumed a large dose of Largestil and passed out. His father later found him unconscious on his room, drove him to the hospital, and had to pump his stomach. Now, as time went on, he got a strong interest for music and fashion. David Bowie and Jim Morrison have been noted to be his favorite sources of inspiration for this. But because he came from a working class background, he would rarely afford to buy vinyls, which often resulted in him stealing them instead. Ian gradually became bored with school and decided to find a job instead. He ended up getting a job in a record shop in Manchester city centre before he moved on to a job in civil service. Later on August 23rd of 1975, Curtis married Deborah Woodruff, whom he had been introduced to by a friend. They had been dating ever since Ian was 16 years old, and together they got a daughter named Natalie, who was born on the 16th of April 1979. To begin with, they lived with Ian's grandparents until they both managed to move, take up a mortgage, and find jobs. None of them really liked their jobs, and not satisfied with their home, they eventually settled with a house in Barton Street, Macclesfield, in early 1977. Now, Joy Division was formed when Ian and three of his childhood friends met at a Sex Pistols gig in 1976. They told Ian about their wishes to form a band, and he had the same idea in mind. So from that moment on, they decided to start practicing together. The early lineup consisted of Bernard Sumner on guitar, Peter Hook on bass, and Terry Mason on drums. But Mason wasn't the optimal drummer for the band, so they eventually settled for Stephen Morris in August of '77. The band initially called themselves Warsaw after one of the songs from David Bowie's then recently released album, Low, but since there was another band with almost the exact same name, they went for Joy Division. This moniker was derived from a 1955 novel, The House of Dolls, which featured a Nazi concentration camp with a sexual slavery wing called Joy Division. In 1978, the band signed to Factory Records after a TV appearance on So It Goes. Ian became known for his awkward demeanor and his unique style of dancing from this point onwards. From time to time, he would also play the guitar, with Sumner stepping in on the synth. Now, going back to his relationship, Deborah would in later years describe her marriage to Ian as very constricted. It was very controlling in the sense that he didn't want her to be in contact with any other men. And according to both his wife and his fellow band members, he started to gain feelings for the Belgian journalist Annick Honoré. Ian started having some sort of an affair with her in the fall of 1979, and apparently he was unable to make a decision whether or not to stay with his wife and his daughter or separate and create a deeper relationship with Annick. But Ian's affair with Honoré wasn't the only thing that impacted him greatly. In late 1978, he began to experience epileptic fits. He was very reluctant to talking about his sickness, but as time passed by, he didn't need to inform people that much about it since he got the medicine he needed to keep it in check. or so he thought at least. In 79 and 80, his conditions worsened as Joy Division started playing more shows. It didn't help that he was continuously smoking, drinking, and he kept up his irregular sleeping habit as well. Because of the side effects of his medicine, he also became emotionally unstable. It was during the time when the band was recording their second album that Ian's condition was at its worst. He was enduring 2 tonic-clonic seizures per week. This is a seizure where you go through 2 phases. You quickly lose consciousness as your limbs are drastically pulled towards and then away from your body, causing you to fall. You might also exhale with the loud sound since your lungs are compressed as well. And then in the second phase, all of your muscles contract and relax rapidly. The worst part of this is that you can severely hurt your tongue because your jaws clap up and down. And secondly, you might hurt yourself while collapsing, which is what happened to Ian during one of the band's recording sessions. After being absent from the studio for 2 hours, the band members went looking for Ian and found him passed out on the toilet with his head smashed into the sink. The other members didn't know how to help Ian. As mentioned before, he was very reluctant to talking about how they could help him and about the sickness in general. So the entire time they remained somewhat ignorant and unable to help him. His seizures also started happening more often while the band performed. When they played a gig at the Rainbow in Finsbury Park in the spring of 1980, the light technicians, despite being instructed not to, turned on the strobe lights, causing Ian to collapse on the stage. They carried him down to the band's dressing room to recuperate, but after getting back on his legs, he made the firm decision to keep the show going, as they had booked a second gig in West Hampstead, where they would play later that night. But sadly enough, he experienced another quite violent seizure only 25 minutes into this show as well. Bernard Sumner would later state that, quote, "Sometimes a particular drum beat would do something to Curtis. He'd go off on a trance for a bit, then he'd lose it and have an epileptic fit. We'd have to stop the show and carry him to the dressing room where he'd cry his eyes out because this appalling thing had just happened to him." Some people believe that his dance intentionally mimicked the muscle spasms he got and was used by Ian to shape the music he made. Now, Tony Wilson, the founder of Factory Records, Joy Division's record label, expressed concerns for Ian's mental and physical well-being during this time and later invited him to live with him and his partner Lindsay. He was living with them in their cottage in Charlesworth for some time, and while being there, he commenced divorce proceedings. This was mainly due to the fact that he'd failed to let go of his contact with Honoré, the journalist. Ian was going through a lot of pressure at this point. He was a man of solitude, but wasn't mentally equipped to live alone. He experienced troubles balancing family life and his time with the band, and his illness didn't make it any easier. In the early hours of the 18th of May 1980, Curtis committed suicide by hanging himself in a kitchen of his house at 77 Barton Street, Macclesfield. He was 23 years old. When his wife, Deborah, found his body the next morning, he had used the kitchen's washing line to hang himself after having penned a note to her in which he declared his love for her despite him recently conducting an affair with Honoré. In her biography, Touching from a Distance, Deborah Curtis recalls when she found his body. "I didn't call his name or go upstairs. At first, I thought he had left because the house smelled strangely fresh. The familiar clinging stench of tobacco wasn't there. He must have caught the train after all. There was an envelope on the living room mantelpiece. My heart jumped when I realized that he had left a note for me. He was kneeling in the kitchen. I was relieved, glad he was there. Now, what are you up to?" I then took a step towards him, about to speak. His head was bowed, his hands resting on the washing machine. I stared at him. He was so still. Then the rope. I hadn't noticed the rope. The rope from the clothes rack was around his neck. Something that had worsened his depression and anxiety and maybe been parts to the puzzle of why he chose to commit suicide at the end was that Joy Division was about to start their US tour. Ian was extremely scared of flying and was concerned of how American audiences would react to his epilepsy. He had also confessed to his close ones on several occasions that he had no desire to live past his 20s, indicating that he was really afraid of just simply growing older. Thank you so much for watching, guys. That was the end of the video. I just want to give an extra shout out to these people over at Patreon. These are actually the people that make it a lot easier for me to create these videos. So if you want to support me as well, then make sure you click the first link in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. Take care. Bye.